Hi everyone, we'll just give you a couple of minutes to shoulder your way into the room. Great to see everybody on this Tuesday for our fortnightly political geek fest with the wonderful Katharine Murphy, who is in her little soundproof booth in Parliament House, where democracy has returned. Isn't it great?
Isn't it great? Yes, here I am in the Chamber of Secrets in yes, in the lockdown Parliament. Anyway, yes, as you were, Peter.
And I always like the fact that that room is like padded walls. I don't know if it's used for things other than sound restraint, but it's a great
well, no one can hear you scream in this room. This is why I'm in here today. So yeah, it's all good.
Anyway, happy Tuesday. Thanks for being part of it. My name's Peter Lewis and welcome to Australia at Home's Political Geek Fest. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and like all of you, wherever you are around Australia, I'm sure you join me in paying respects to elders past, present and emerging, recognising the land that we're all on was never ceded. I don't think I need to do the rules, but get your chat on, get your camera on, feel part of the room, feel part of the occasion, share some questions and we'll go to the room as we go. But Katharine, before we go into this week's Guardian Essential Report, what is it like to get the Parliament happening again, and how does democracy feel at the moment?
Democracy has returned to the nation's capital. Well, it is a strange, they've all been a bit strange, these COVID sittings, but this one I was just actually telling Peter before we all came online that this one's the most sort of aggressively public health sitting that we've had. And what I mean by that is that there's people downstairs in the corridors handing out masks if you happen to be roaming areas and you're not wearing one. So we haven't had those restrictions before because we've sort of had pared back sittings. But this fortnight, the officials around the Parliament are highly attentive to the risks of outbreak, given that we've got MPs back from around the country and also their staff. We've had MPs quarantining either in Canberra or in Melbourne and Queensland prior to their arrivals here, and they'll also need to quarantine on the other side of this sitting, which does make it quite onerous for people, I guess, to be in home detention. Anyway, we'll get to that, Peter, won't we? Home detention in this conversation.
We certainly will.
But anyway, so it's good to see them back. It's good to see them circulating around, although everybody, unsurprisingly, is exercising a degree of caution in human interactions during this sitting. There's a lot more activity happening on the phone than in person. People are worried, I guess. An outbreak here would mean an outbreak in the ACT, and obviously that's a risk that no government wants to manage just at this point in time.
So just explain, the logistics of it is that you've got people in the chamber and then you've got TV screens, but the ones on screen, they can kind of wave, but they can't actually vote? Is that
they can't vote. Yeah, they're present. We've got a bunch of people on screens, people who have not come up, people in Melbourne and Brisbane and other places. Not heaps, but certainly some. MPs have sat out this sitting, but they obviously want to participate to the extent possible. So.
And have they been paired? Has there been a pair sort of deal done?
There is pairing arrangements in the chambers to take account of people who are physically present, not physically present, but not in the chambers. It's all very elaborate, those pairing rules just at the moment. And there was, if you follow politics closely, and everyone tuning in, of course, does to this forum, you'll know that there was a big palaver over the last couple of weeks as the Parliament attempted to grapple with the 21st century and technology. The Attorney General, Christian Porter, was very worried that the internet might break and other things. As parliamentarians participated in democracy remotely. So far, so good on that front, although let's not tempt fate, but people, just have popped up on video screens. For example, in question time yesterday, if folks were watching, you may have seen that I think it was the second question that Labor asked in the pack yesterday was from Richard Marles, who is the Labor Party's deputy leader. He's in Melbourne, so he asked a question from his Melbourne office.
And how did that go?
It's a bit weird, sort of seeing them bob up on a television screen, sort of looking a bit awkward in front of a lot of them are using this backdrop of Hansards or whatever the bound volumes are sort of behind them, which sort of, we've one of the jokes during the pandemic for everyone, I think, has been, with so many people doing Skype crosses and things for telly, what's your background? Like, I mean, my background is my screaming cell, but some people have, radically elaborate backgrounds, beautiful artwork or learned libraries behind them or whatever else. Parliamentarians so far seem to have gone the kind of, so they look a bit startled, I must say, but I'm sure they'll get used to it like the rest of the country has.
I do feel they've probably missed a break over the last 6 months thinking about how they could run real remote democracy. It seems like they've kind of just said, okay, well, there's still the real democracy here and everything else, you're just sort of saying hello. It was really interesting, I thought, to watch the way the Democrats ran their convention. I know that's not a parliament, but they did it so well on these platforms. So
it is a bit bloodless, though, isn't it? I mean, look, obviously we have to, and I agree with you in terms of the bits I saw of the Democratic National Convention, and I've seen some clips of the Republicans today as well, and obviously that's the world we all live in. So we need to be fluent and familiar with all of these technologies, and they are brilliant. We can, in this forum here we are, we can all see each other's faces, and we don't. That's really important.
Sometimes even break out. I think you're just buffering there a bit, Katharine. Hopefully you'll find your way back in. Just talking about how great technology was.
Oh no, have I returned?
Yes, you're back. You're back with us. You were just lagging there for a bit.
Oh dear. Oh, that's a worry.
So we were talking about how great the technology was going, I think.
Yeah, then of course that'll be the moment you buffer. Anyway, there's been some interesting debates. The Senate President Scott Ryan actually raised some really interesting questions around this in a short contribution in the Senate yesterday, where he rather courageously, I think, stood up to the government. He was sort of asserting the right for the Senate to be able to sit, that this was a very important right that is embedded in the Constitution, and that the executive should not seek to prevent parliamentarians from physically being here and representing their states, representing their constituencies in the People's House, but that was a fundamental right in the Australian democracy. It was a really interesting contribution. If you've got 5 minutes, you might want to track it down. The Parliament has to embrace the internet, and the pandemic has made them do it.
For that, I guess there's a small mercy there. So let's jump into the findings this week. It's kind of interesting that we're kind of, I think, halfway through the full lockdown in Melbourne. And again, if you are joining us from Melbourne, our thoughts are with you all, including our head geek, John Remington, who's going to be helping us dig a bit deeper into the numbers as we go. But I'll just share in, and hopefully not do my normal inelegant effort, but hopefully that's now showing you our slideshow. And I guess the first one we want to kick off today was looking at the level of concern. I guess we've been obsessing about this a little bit, Katharine, over the journey. What's interesting this week is just the shift from very concerned to quite concerned in terms of where things are at. And I think even the sense that Melbourne's still in lockdown, but the numbers are starting to stabilise, and critically, it seems to be still under control in New South Wales, and there's a little bit going on in Queensland at the moment, but even there, still a degree that Australia is holding the line, which I think is reflected in both this slide and then the next one, which I know galls many of our progressive friends, which is that, well, that's the concern one. Sorry, the government performance is still really strong, 62%, thinking it's being very good or quite good. So, for all the noise and mess, and we'll talk about aged care a little bit as well, the show feels like it's still holding together. Is that reflected down there? Is there a sense that there are now cracks that Labor's trying to exploit, or is it still Team Australia?
Oh no, I think look, to some degree, I think still Team Australia, because it is genuinely difficult to sort of be a pugnacious opposition at a point, and I think we discussed this last time. In this forum, it is difficult to be pugnacious when the nation wants governments to succeed, because if governments succeed, then we all succeed. So I think there's always caution in Labor's positioning, but where Labor's sort of starting to go to town is on aged care, which, and we'll get to those aged care questions in a tick. But that's a clear front that has opened up in the daily battles between the government and the opposition about whether or not the government's performance during COVID has been competent or not. I think I was just talking to some MPs earlier, actually.
You're buffering again. I think it's not just me. John's shaking his head too. So you're buffering, Katharine, so hopefully you'll come back up in a sec.
Where the outbreaks in residential aged care, have happened in their electorates, and oh God, I don't know why.
Yeah. Maybe just for the next little bit, just turn your camera off, and then we'll at least be able to hear you while we're watching the slides, and then we'll see if you get back in. Hello. So I was going to ask Katharine about her fantastic interview.
Am I back?
Oh, you're back. Hello. Just while we got lost in the noise there.
That's weird. I've got you guys fine.
Excellent. Well, that's good to know. That's a good show for you. The other 150 we'll have to work on.
Hello.
But, hello.
Yep.
You spoke to Albo in your podcast last week as well.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Hello.
Just keep talking and we'll tell you if it stops working.
Okay,
again.
I am talking. Is that okay?
It is.
Are we good? All right. Okay, I'll keep talking. Yes, thank you for the throw on the pod. I did have a conversation with the opposition leader last weekend just about the complexities of being an opposition at this point in time, which is worth you chasing down if you haven't heard it. He and I discussed the difficulties in our respective spheres of trying to hold governments accountable when at a time when people are scared and anxious and want governments to succeed. And he foreshadowed the toughening up on aged care, which is a very fertile ground, I think, for starting to make the case that maybe not every single thing the government has done throughout the pandemic has been absolutely up in terms of what you call what.
Sorry, folks. This is the first time we've had problems out of Parliament House. I'm going to maybe ask Katharine if you could just to disconnect and come back in, and we might just keep going through these numbers. John and myself for a sec there, Katharine, but sorry guys, this is I guess we can blame Malcolm Turnbull and the NBN, although I suspect, the gremlins find ways in all the time. John, if we look at the state by state findings here, I found that fascinating that we see that the states that are locking down the hardest are now also benefiting the most. If you look at WA and you look at Queensland in particular, which has got an election coming up, the numbers of people that are approving the government's response is really high. But also, and it's not on this slide, I think that's because I put the wrong bloody deck up. We also had some numbers showing the really low levels of negative or disapproval of the government's response. And in Queensland, that's quite marked, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So down in Queensland, well, we've got up there the 73% approval. We use a equal scale. So we for the disapproval side, that's down at 9%. So very little opposition there. And what we've seen, and we had a bit of a deep dive in Victoria last wave as well, was that these figures are very linked to the number of cases that we're seeing in each of the states. So when Victoria did have its second wave, or the spike and outbreaks that we've seen down here, that's when there was a big shift in the approval of the government. So yeah, it's that correlation to I think a lot of the other external factors which are happening, which is ultimately resulting in the number of cases in each state.
So what is the number there for Queensland?
So the disapproval in Queensland is 9%, and that's amongst the lowest. It's 9% in Queensland, and in those states with the lower populations that we show on the map here, so South Australia and Western Australia, that's at 10 and 7%. So disapproval in Victoria is obviously a bit higher at 35%, but still good rating is slightly higher than negative rating. And in New South Wales, that's sitting at 17% negative rating compared to the 59% positive.
Great. We're just trying to get Katharine back on the line at the moment. I reckon what we might do, because I really don't want to miss her on the next lot of figures because they're rippers, is come up for some air and maybe just see, you know, we don't do this very often, but it'd be a nice thing to do at the moment. If anyone in the chat wants to have a bit of a chat about how they see, you know, the politics playing out at the moment, we'll just sort of open mic it for a few minutes while we wait for Katharine to come back in. So
I've just seen a comment from Philip come up there about the approval ratings, whether or not they run down party lines. One of the things we did point out this week is that we are seeing at a national level, the approval amongst people who identify themselves as likely Labour voters is starting to slip off. So at the height of the more national lockdowns, amongst Labour voters, approval was over 70%, 69% it reached in June. That's down to just over 50% this week. So that's sitting 55%. So whilst the approval amongst the coalition voters is maintaining, it is starting to erode from that national consensus.
You know, and in a way, Victoria is the only state where that approval, disapproval really reflects, I guess, life out of wartime. I think it was 47-32 or something, but still in the middle of an unprecedented 6-week second lockdown, it's holding. And I find this remarkable, the degree to which that things are holding for governments across the country. And, you know, we saw the Northern Territory result over the weekend. The incumbents are returned. I don't see anything there to suggest that the Queensland government isn't on its way to being returned as well. And I suspect, you know, if an election was held tomorrow, that would be the story federally as well. Joe Barkworth actually wants to know if we are going to analyse the NT election result. I guess to the extent that I've just said, you know, the incumbents got returned, yes. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add or any question you've got there, Joe, if you want to come in. And I don't know if you're NT based or just watching it from a distance.
Watching from a distance from Queensland.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, it's very line ball, and we haven't got the data banks to actually monitor Northern Territory either, but you know, they got returned, and I don't think there was a huge surprise there. So we think Katharine's back. Katharine, if you're back, say hello, and we'll get you in and get your hot take on Northern Territory before we start talking about some of the more repressive instincts of the Australian population. Hello? We can hear you, we can't see you. All right. God, this is awkward, isn't it, everyone? Anyway, we'll jump back in and I'll start talking about the repressive elements of the Australian population as we make our way through. Here we go. We're back in. So, John, do you want to take us through these figures, particularly looking at the agree, disagree, but these are really strong. These are really strong results in terms of setting the scene for harsher restrictions to contain the virus. If you want to go through these line by line, then I'll give you my theory of the world out the back of it, John.
Yeah,
but I'll
sure.
just try to connect with Katharine because she can't hear us though.
So just as a bit of background for everyone, what we were really interested in is some of the other measures which have been introduced or at least considered internationally and how they would play out in Australian context. And yeah, I was quite surprised, and we'll hear Peter's view in a second about how high some of these figures are. So over on the left there, we've got 65%, which is essentially 2/3, supporting for the full closure of international borders. And we were very specific that was to international travellers, but also returning Australian citizens who have obviously done some of the quarantine requirements as they've been coming back to the country, particularly in Victoria. Tracking bracelets is something which has been mentioned and considered, and there's 60% support for that. So that's to ensure people are self-isolating and not interacting whilst they should be staying at home. In line with some of the what we'll talk about shortly, 63% support for the transferal of aged care residents who have been tested positive for COVID-19 to be transferred to a public hospital, and just over half, 52% support for quarantine in a dedicated facility and not in a household, which is, I believe, what New Zealand are looking to move towards at the minute. So we did ask some questions last time to Victorian residents about the lockdown measures that we've got down here. And there was about 70% support for those which have already been introduced. And for those of you not in Victoria, that includes an 8 p.m. curfew, single person from a household visiting shops, no travel beyond 5 kilometres of your home. So these are lower than what is being introduced in Victoria, the support for those, but still pretty high. And I think, as I said, higher than I might have initially guessed at. So, Peter, do you have a take on that?
Look, I think that the findings from last week with really high support for the lockdown and these just say that people are probably a little bit, if you see that particularly the federal government is trying to open things up and get moving, I think the majority of people aren't with that yet. These are actually quite remarkable findings. And hi, Katharine, you're back.
I'm back.
And you're out of the cave.
I'm out of the cave. Yeah,
so we're just looking at these numbers that sort of blew us away last night when they came through. But I think the ones that really stand out: close of international borders to returning Australian citizens. There's still 450 a day coming back in.
Yeah.
The ankle bracelets, which is a more extreme measure than most are suggesting, and as I called them last night, leper colonies, so that anyone that is in quarantine should not isolate from home, but in an actual facility. That says to me that the talk about opening up quickly is dissonant with where the population is in quite a profound way.
Yeah, it's the combination of these results, which are genuinely remarkable. I nearly fell off my chair last night, as Peter knows. With also the results last week. I just came on the tail end of that. I think John was referring to those in terms of the high levels of support in Victoria for these lockdown measures. It's amazing. We clearly, as a community, have accepted the restrictions on liberty as the price of being able to flatten the curve of infections. Now, I mean, I support obviously public health restrictions and have throughout this crisis, and they've been shown to work. So at one level, why are we surprised that there are high levels of community support? Because these restrictions do flatten the curve of infections. They did in the first wave, and they clearly are doing so at the moment in Victoria in terms of the trend of infections. But I guess one thing that does concern me a little bit is how much these incursions into people's liberties, daily liberties, are becoming normalised during this pandemic. I've had quite a few conversations with readers online who are amazingly supportive of these public health restrictions and don't want to hear any alternative arguments to how they should or shouldn't be balanced against liberty. And I think there is a bit of a danger for us if we normalise the environment that we're in at this point in time. And again, that's not me saying I don't support restrictions, because I actually do. And I think any sensible-minded person does. But it's amazing to me how comfortable we are with the degree of incursions to liberty that's happening during this pandemic. We've got police going door to door, defence door knockers. We've got people in combat fatigue standing on borders. It's pretty scary stuff in a democracy, all of this. Now, I mean, all this power is being exercised benignly by governments who genuinely want to keep people safe. But I don't know, I just think we ought to be a bit attentive to how comfortable we're feeling with all of this big brother in our collective existence.
Hey, John, Nellie's asked a question that we were talking about before, which is this just people talking about restrictions for other people, or is the Victorian numbers pretty similar?
Yeah, so the Victorian numbers are similar to other states. There's nothing across those 4 measures to suggest that support in Victoria is any higher than other states. The biggest difference is mainly to do with the age. So people over 55 are more supportive of these measures. Younger people, 18 to 34, are more likely to be more opposed. And
the other thing I picked up was they're really similar numbers between Coalition and Labor voters, whereas the Greens and the kind of, we call them other, but it's the One Nation and the right-wing independents, it's much lower support. So it's almost like those that support a majority party support the government having greater power, whether they're a Labor or a Liberal voter. And it's the ones on the edge that have got less regard. Now, can I give you my hot take on this? Because I was trying to make sense of this last night, Katharine, and I'm ready for you to knock this one down. And I've put a link to my piece that's just gone up in The Guardian on this as well, which is, it feels to me that this is a new telling of the notion of border protection. So border protection has been something the coalition's exploited for the last 25 odd years. My theory had always been that it was a fig leaf for economic globalization. The government, or the coalition, was never interested in protecting us economically. So they created a proxy war around our borders and boat people as if that was going to change, people's life materially, even though the people of Lindsay apparently thought it did. But it was all about giving the perception that we had strong borders, and they exploited it to the nth degree, really as a cover for economic liberalisation. Now we've got the economic liberalisations trying to effectively weaken border protection, or the health.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of seeing there's a little bit of border protection karma going on here in the politics. And I totally get what you're saying about not sitting back and letting this become the new normal. But I also think, particularly in the context of the libertarian attacks on the Andrews government, and to an extent the sort of opportunistic attacks on Labor states, which is starting to bubble to the surface. Like they go hard on Queensland and WA, less hard on South Australia and New South Wales, that I think there is this sort of growing sense that borders are going to become back to being a political fault line, but potentially the reverse tamper.
Yeah, well, it is interesting. I saw your piece, and obviously, as always, recommend people read it today. It is interesting, and it's true. There is this kind of reversal of the general politics of borders in Australia, and along the fault line you suggest, Peter. It's sort of some of the kind of political voices in Australia who have been loudest on stopping the boats are now screeching about sort of incursions of personal liberty with the closure of state borders. It is a funny reversal. Also, I suppose there is some, the governments, WA, Queensland, others are pursuing border closures at this point in time, not because that's consistent with health advice, because it isn't, but because it's politically popular. People do want to people don't want to get coronavirus. I understand that. I don't want to get it either. I don't want anybody I know to get it. So it sort of goes back to those primal, visceral feelings that people have about their own security, and their own security in a very uncertain world. And as you say, Peter, there has been this sort of interesting juxtaposition with conservative political parties in Australia over the last sort of 20 years, that there's been this whole sort of sovereignty push around closing the borders at the same time while accelerating Australia's economic integration into the rest of the world. And we know from all around the world how powerful borders and the nation state are in the psyche of people in the world at the moment. We saw it in Brexit. You know, we're seeing it in the American political context with Trump building walls and so on and so forth. There's a really deep kind of level on which walling yourself off from others works in the current political environment. But I don't know, again, I've got some discomfort about it.
So you kind of have public health meets populism, which creates a really convenient hiving off back into the nation state. The argument for globalization becomes a lot harder though, doesn't it?
Yes, well, the argument for globalisation at this point in history is sort of borderline impossible. I'm sorry, I apologise. Are you guys getting noise? You guys?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we're happy with the corridor. It's better than the lag. Yeah.
Is it manageable?
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
I'm sorry. Everybody's just gearing up to go to question time, so we've got photographers and journos about to burst down the corridor next to me.
Exciting.
Yeah. Well, it's just another day in Parliament. Yeah, look, if you're a sort of globalist at the moment, to quote Donald Trump, you're on a hiding to nothing, and there is this sort of, I guess, something that the pandemic has brought out, this resurgent sense of the nation, nationalism. There's sort of been a quiet kind of resurgence, I think, in Australia of the idea of what Australian exceptionalism might be. You know, we've, particularly in the first round of the pandemic, where we flattened the curve very successfully. So it's, well, all you can say is these are interesting times, and certainly leaders who talk about sovereignty, who talk about nations, who talk about security, who talk about, you know, people's personal safety and security are going to do well in the current environment, which is why you hear Scott Morrison talk about that an awful lot.
Yeah. Well, let's move into a topic where the government has not been tracking quite so swimmingly, which is around aged care. We asked a few questions this week, and I think it gives us a little bit of a picture, not so much of a way through for the government, but just the level of public confusion with what is actually going on. So we kind of asked a couple of questions just to gauge. A lot of the debate has been this sort of vague fight between state and feds and who's responsible and who to blame and where does the buck stop. People don't really get it. 49% think the government's responsible for the regulation and funding, 27% state governments, 25% say the aged care providers are making it up as they go along. It's quite a strange mix of perceptions. And that's backed by this next slide, which is then in terms of attributing blame, it's really mixed as well. 28% say the most responsible is the Fed government, 30% state and territories, 42% again saying, no, it's you providers which are to blame. Now, I guess you can cut and dice this a few ways. One of the points that John made when he was looking at these numbers was, you know, those who get that the government funds it blame the federal government. It's where there's a lack of understanding of the models underneath, creates the confusion in accountability. So given that it is kind of a fog of smoke around the way that this system operates, I'm interested in how that issue is being sort of dealt with in the Parliament this week, and is it seen as an issue to politically exploit, or is it being seen as a problem to be solved?
I think possibly a bit of both, but I think predominantly a problem to be solved. I think what this shows us, or what these results show us, sorry, I'm just going to walk here again out of...
You're doing an amazing job in
good,
such trying circumstances.
No,
Thanks for
all
not
good.
giving up on us, Katharine.
No, I apologise to everyone. It's just trying to find a place where I'm not going to be stampeded by the run to question time in about 15 minutes. So cross our fingers. Look, I think what the figures in the poll, that Scott Morrison's instinct for wanting to not be the only guy left with aged care has some political strategy behind it, right? We see that, as you said a minute ago, Peter, people who know that the Commonwealth funds aged care think that the Commonwealth is responsible for aged care. If you don't understand the intricacies of the system, then you don't know who to blame for what's happened. You know something dreadful's happened, but you don't know who to blame. And I think Scott Morrison's strategy, which I found deeply unfulfilling over the last few weeks, is to take some share of the blame, but assign it also to Daniel Andrews. Every time that he accepts some blame for what's gone wrong, he puts Andrews in the frame too. He does it every time that he has apologised or made some sort of mea culpa. Now, I mean, I don't think this is a very good look for the Prime Minister. I think it underscores the sort of worst caricature of himself with the Australian people. I think if people have got negative views of Scott Morrison, it relates to the fact that he won't take responsibility for things. He doesn't like being accountable for things, and he doesn't like answering questions. And I think all of those, call them his worst qualities, have been amply on display over the last 2 weeks. But
the other thing, just to break in there, it also shows he's not learning from his success, because the one thing this process has taught us, that people will accept politicians saying, I got it wrong, these are unusual times, I will learn from my mistakes. And he's almost got to leap past there, and he could say, I'm the guy to fix this, rather than be working out who's to blame, couldn't he? And you have gone into another dead zone. It was nice while it lasted, though.
Move again.
I'll move.
Am I back? Is that better?
Yep, you're back.
Okay, I'll try not to move.
Though, just to see when you're in and when you're out.
I'm sorry. There must be all kinds of. This must be a dreadful viewing experience. I really apologise profusely to everyone. Yes, look, it is as you suggest. That's exactly what the Prime Minister is setting up. He's setting up a situation where everything hasn't gone right, but he will learn from his mistakes, and he will be the guy who comes in at the end of the Aged Care Royal Commission and tries to create a better aged care system at the end. That is the political narrative he's trying to set up. But I think it has been really ugly over the last couple of weeks to constantly also implicate others. But with that said, the strategy is clearly working. The strategy clearly works, because you
fill the arena with rubbish, and then people don't know.
Exactly. You can see the confusion in the figures. People don't know who to blame. They don't know if it's Morrison or Andrews or the state premier, or whether it's the providers. So it's sort of like Morrison is a clever political strategist, and you can see I think in these numbers some of that strategy bearing fruit. But anyway, I've been more conscious of the fact that, as I said a minute ago, that his kind of negative qualities have been on display rather than the brilliant strategy behind it. But anyway, our data seems to suggest that the PM's strategy is working.
Indeed. And I guess the final one is, we've got you probably can't see it on your screen at the moment, but the statements about aged care. There's broad agreement on negative propositions about the authorities failing to prepare, but also around the hygiene and care standards within the homes being poor. Whether that's a chicken or an egg proposition, and whether the authorities are also partly to blame for that, is probably another line of questioning. I guess the only other point I'd make in the context of the pandemic is that there was already a Royal Commission going on. There was a recognition that the system that had really been, it had never been designed. It had evolved from a market-based solution to not recognising that you just couldn't have everybody being cared for in state-owned nursing homes as the population aged and that ageing demographic grew, has effectively created a bit of a market where there are good providers and less good providers, I guess, and no real way of, you know, having a guarantee to older Australians that they're going to get the care they deserve. And, you know, they say that the pandemic sort of, you know, shows up the cracks in a society, and this is definitely the one that we need to confront.
No, absolutely, because it's sort of, in a way, if you compare us to some other countries, and that point about the pandemic being the great revealer, right? The great revealer of weakness in societies, in economies, in all of those sorts of things. We haven't. Our experience of that has not been as stark as countries elsewhere. Obviously, it's been there. We've revealed over the course of the last 6 months the difficulties of insecure work, the difficulties of people having different rights in the labour market. Obviously, we're heading into really dreadful times of high unemployment, and we've had aged care, which is sort of the great big, horrible mirror that none of us can turn away from. Yeah, what the pandemic has revealed is the dreadful state of aged care in this country, and it's kind of remarkable that the sort of that the system has drifted to this point of vulnerability, given everybody has experience of aged care in their extended families, and given that we have this demographic bulge in Australia that's looming where many of us will need aged care. Yeah. It's kind of extraordinary how little focus this gets. But I think the pandemic and the persistence of the pandemic sadly will turn more of a spotlight on it. And I think it's been really interesting, actually, Peter, to see the aged care Royal Commissioners really absolutely double down in this area, both Councillor Sisting with his remarks to the Royal Commission, whenever that was, last week or the week before. We saw the Commission issue a statement yesterday with the two commissioners saying that it's just unfathomable that Australia hasn't got proper measurable quality standards and public reporting standards. Quite amazing and unusual for Royal Commissioners mid-process to be issuing statements that are critical of the status quo. And that suggests to me that these aged care commissioners are determined that the spotlight is not going to move, that while we've got some national attention on a sector that desperately needs national attention and political will, that these guys are going to be shining the spotlight as hard as they can.
Yeah. And just a final point, I should be probably disclosed, we do work for the not-for-profit providers in the aged care sector, and we've been doing quite a few of these events with families of providers that are in crisis. And I'd make a couple of observations from what I've seen without betraying any confidences. One is that none of these not-for-profits are in the game to live the high life or do people wrong. They are working in a system that is severely constrained. And particularly after the pandemic hit, they had entire workforces that couldn't go to work anymore, that knew the way their community operated, and they've had to bring in contract workforces to fill those gaps. And those facilities have been working under the most trying conditions over these past 6 months now, and particularly the nursing professionals that oversee it are just working 18-hour days every day, and they know that when things go bad, people are going to die. And one of the things that I think is, I won't say heartening, but solid, is that by focusing back on government responsibility, we don't turn it into a morality play about evil nursing homes, because I think that's a convenient but not necessarily an accurate narrative.
Well, what the whole crisis demonstrates is that the system needs reform, and that means at the government level and also at the provider level. But there is, as you say, Peter, there's no point in turning around blaming the providers for playing the hand they're dealt. So the conversation that we've got to have about aged care in this country is about much more than whether one provider is providing a good service. It's about structuring a system so that it can take care of us when we're elderly, and so that we don't have to suffer the terrible indignities that people clearly suffer in aged care every day of the week.
Indeed. And just to change pace, one final slide, which is another live event, but it also, I think, reinforces that whole argument of filling the arena with noise means that something like the debate about gas pipelines is really not resonating with the public at the moment. 27% support, 27% opposition, 14% unsure, 32% don't know. It ends up being kind of a shrugs your shoulders issue, but it's really significant, and it's still being sort of pushed through pretty aggressively by the government at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is important, and it will, this whole sort of agenda of the gas-led COVID recovery will break cover reasonably soon. Gas-led recovery. Did I say that? Gas-led recovery. I think those are the words that the Prime Minister likes and others.
I don't know if that one's going to land. It sounds like a lot of hot air, doesn't it?
I wondered if you'd go there.
I couldn't help myself. Yeah, I'm sure it's unoriginal.
Anyway, but as you say, it's sort of there's only so much bandwidth at the moment, and I think it's pandemic first, every other issue distant second, third, fourth, whatever, and people just haven't got the bandwidth to take in these issues in depth and to have sort of settled views about them. So, and again, that can be kind of scary about what agendas can take shape during those sort of times where there's a big issue crowding out every other thing.
So what do the next couple of weeks look like? We've got 2 weeks of sitting. Are we going to, at the end of that, have this economic statement, or is that the next time they're back? Or
that's October, yeah. That's we basically have this sitting fortnight, and then I think, although I haven't double checked the sitting timetable today, I think we get up and we don't come back until the budget, which is October. Then I think we have a fairly frenetic sitting agenda between the October budget and the end of the year. The year's just all off course. Normally we would have had the budget done in May, and we would still actually now be in the winter recess, and then we'd be coming back for the traditional end of year sprint to the finish. But we've got the budget basically loaded up against the end of year sprint to the finish. So but in terms of what's going to happen, well, I think the government's going to use the budget to try and sort of establish a what comes next narrative in a policy sense, like post-COVID. The question will be whether or not there's the national bandwidth on the part of the voters to kind of process it and absorb that. When you look at people are so attentive to them, to day-to-day practicalities in the crisis. How attentive are they going to be to what comes next? I don't know. That's kind of the open question, really, of the period between now and the next election, because the political strategies of both of these parties, both the government and the opposition, rely on people being able to engage with that question. What does Australia look like on the other side of this pandemic? Because it's that territory on and around which the next election will be fought, with two competing visions of what that looks like. So, but whether or not people have got the headspace for it, I don't know. We'll see.
So I've got a few questions. We might just bring a couple of people in. Mitzi, do you want to ask your question about gas? As I will start asking. She was particular. I say two things. Mitzi wanted to point out there is currently submissions that you can make. Oh, hello. There you go.
Oh, yeah. That's right. There's in Melbourne, we're at the moment putting in submissions against the AGL gas terminal and the APA pipeline, and I mentioned in my submission Alan Finkel agreeing with gas as a transition fuel. And this morning in The Age, there's a letter from scientists opposing Alan Finkel's view. So, Katharine, would you like to address that possibly?
In what way? Yes, I'm aware of all of those developments, but what's your question?
Oh, if you could just talk to that and comment on it.
What the other scientists taking issue with Finkel?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well, there's the story this morning, as I understand it. There's a bunch of scientists, including prominent clients, climate change experts, taking issue with Finkel's adoption of gas as a transition fuel. I just feel incredible deja vu with this argument, because we had gas as the transition fuel argument 10 years ago with the carbon price, and 10 years ago, the gas as a transition fuel was relevant because renewables were basically in their infancy at this point. The energy market's moved on considerably since then. But, you know, I think there are some complexities in this argument. I know that Finkel is sort of invoked as often a supporter of gas as a transition fuel, which suggests that he's not interested in more renewable technologies. I don't think that's the case about Finkel. Finkel has sort of been one of the leading voices, basically pushing the development of hydrogen and green hydrogen as an alternative fuel. Anyway, I just think the debate's got a long way to run. I find it an irritating debate, because I feel like we've been here before, and I'm really quite confused about why we're here again. But anyway, we are here again. And look, there's certainly, the debate gets a bit confused too, because obviously there's gas in the electricity market. That's obviously one potential use of gas. Then there's also gas as a feedstock for heavy duty manufacturing. That's another set of issues. They do get conflated. Anyway, but in terms of gas as a transition fuel for the energy market, well, the document, you know, the source document on that is the ISP, that is the Australian Energy Market Operator document for how the electricity market will run over the next 20 years. And they say gas is a tiny percentage of the overall energy mix. There are different arguments in manufacturing. Anyway, but we're going to have months of this, and don't ever ask me to talk about gas, because talk about Geekfest, I will go deep geek.
We might have to have a special gas bags. Yeah,
gas bag.
All that. Patricia Pauline had a question. It's a simple, short one. Back on aged care. Are you there, Pauline?
Yes, I am. So
Hi.
I'm interested, Katharine, particularly in your views about the future for the aged care minister. Will he survive, particularly given his performance at the Senate inquiry last week? I would have thought he'd have those fingers written on his hand.
Yeah, it was really sort of quite unfathomable how he couldn't have the stats to hand. Although, I mean, I feel a certain amount of sympathy, because obviously these people are working in really, really stressful conditions where material is coming at them through a fire hose. You know, I mean, that is the truth of it. They're being briefed around the clock. They're making decisions around the clock. Sometimes they're going to fluff figures. That's just life. The fact that he couldn't remember these particular figures was particularly unfortunate, and it gave, it basically put vision on the public record that the government is, will be deeply distressed, is on the public record. Look, as for Colbeck, I don't think he's our problem. I think the problems go deeper than one minister. What one minister has or hasn't done in relation to this pandemic. The problems are systemic. They're what we were talking about a second ago, which is how governments front up to the enormous task that's before them in providing Australians with a decent, dignified level of aged care. So I guess I'm less interested in Colbeck and his future, and more interested in whether or not this government will actually front up to the responsibility that we need them to front up with in terms of trying to create an aged care system that actually works for people.
Great, thanks. And a final question from Carl, if you're there, Carl, which is sort of looking further down the path.
Oh, thanks. I was just interested in what space you think the opposition, the Labor opposition, has in trying to negotiate some changes to the JobKeeper changes that are being introduced into this session.
I think we'll see some changes that have come from the government negotiating not only with Labor but also with the trade union movement. I think we'll see some flexibility around some of the industrial conditions that the government were trying to place on these payments. But as for Labor, Labor has sort of been making several points over the last couple of weeks. One, the most forceful one being that the government shouldn't be cutting these payments right now, given given the second wave in Victoria, given the uncertainty in New South Wales, that they shouldn't be tapering these payments right now because there's too many uncertainties, and it might end up stranding people who desperately need income support. But I think the Labor's form to date has been to make its points to secure what it can through negotiations. And Labor has secured various things along the way through these negotiations. They haven't erected big statues to themselves in the public square saying how marvellous they've been in order to get these concessions, but they have consistently actually got concessions throughout the pandemic. And possibly those concessions have been granted because they haven't erected statues to themselves in the public sphere. Perhaps just trying to keep your eye on making sure people don't starve is the most important objective, I guess, at this point in time. So anyway, a bit long-winded, mate, but Labor's form to date has been to hang a spotlight over a problem, negotiate as forcefully as it can to try and get some concessions. The government has given concessions in previous rounds of the kitchen on these payments, but at the end of the day, Labor has not to date held up any major legislation that the government has put through during the pandemic, and I would be very surprised if they held up legislation in this instance as well. It just hasn't been their form to date.
Great. Hey, thanks everyone. Now, Katharine, next time we'll call this a book club and we'll all have read your quarterly essay. When's it going on sale?
Yes. Oof, it's at the printers. No, it's. I believe it's out on the 7th of September or a bit earlier if you're a subscriber. I think you get it a bit early if you subscribe. So if you haven't subscribed, do subscribe.
Great. And yeah, we can talk all about that. We'll be back here on Thursday. We're talking to Ant Sharwood, who's put a fantastic book out about walking the Australian Alps in the middle of last summer and ending up in the middle of a bushfire, which is
oh my God,
quite a journey that brings in brumbies and bushfires and self-isolation. So join us on Thursday. Thanks a lot, Katharine, for really trying circumstances and hanging in there. Thank you, everyone else, for hanging in there as well. That's what we're all doing at the moment. We're hanging in there and trying to sort of support each other by sharing ideas and sending each other good vibes. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you again soon and have a great rest of the day. Off to question time, Katharine.
Yes, off to QT. Thank you for your patience, everyone. See ya.
Bye.